So the first major theme that I think was in this book, and it's a little long-winded, so forgive me. Church leadership should be about servanthood, equipping others, and encouraging and inspiring people to pursue God. So I felt like that was kind of Joshua's, or the point of Joshua. And it was a big crux of what the character Joshua does in this book. And look, the book came out in 1983, so I don't want to say I'm going to spoil things, but I think we kind of also need to get to, they make it clear by chapter 3 that Joshua is not just a man named Joshua.
Yes.
Joshua is actually Jesus returned to earth.
Right.
And living as man again, right? Now, for purposes of a book like this, we need to suspend our theological understanding of why this wouldn't be the case.
Yeah.
The next coming of Christ, I think, is going to be much more involved than what we read in this book.
Yeah.
But the point of it was to get us to think.
Yes.
Right? Not to say this is how this could happen. It's to get us to think. That's why it's fiction, right? So as Joshua goes around, one of the big things he ends up doing is he ends up talking to everybody around him about religion because they bring it up, and they start asking him like what his religious affiliations are. And he ends up having a lot of conversations about concerns about church leadership, about church structure, and about how some leaders abuse that power, right? So he ends up giving several really big speeches to clergy about not abusing their positions and about understanding the purpose of the church, right? He gets very concerned about clergy controlling the day-to-day of people's lives and treating people as smaller and incapable of communing with God on their own, right? And he uses art. So we read in that little passage, he makes this statue of Moses, right, for the synagogue, which really kind of kicks off a lot of the religious discussion, because he makes this statue of Moses for the synagogue, and his friends, the people he's met, are like, "Well, I saw you at our church. Are you Jewish or are you Protestant? What are you? Kind of what are you?" And that kind of kicks off a lot of their discussion, right? So he provides messages with that, though. Like, so when he makes that carving of Moses, it actually has this profound effect on that community when they look at it. And what's interesting about it is when they look at it, and I think the author did a really good job at kind of portraying this in written word, is, this statue that they're looking at conveys a message. Yeah. And it impacts them. It makes them think about things. It makes them consider, like, how would they respond? It's almost like a parable in a parable. How would they respond to Moses if he were there today? Yeah. And how would he respond to them, right? As we're trying to see how we would respond to Jesus, and how would Jesus respond to us, right? Yeah. So he gives these carvings away, or he sells them, really. He also does several carvings of Peter that speak differently to two different ministers who are at different places in their lives. And this is actually one of the quotes here that Joshua says about Peter. He has a lot of fondness for Peter. Because Joshua remembers, like, as he goes through, he has these memories of who the people were that he spent time with, and as Jesus, and this is an excerpt in that regard. On the contrary, Joshua said, that is Peter at his greatest. It is not part of Peter's personality to serve. He was born to rule, and that dominated his whole personality. As he grew spiritually to more resemble the Master and realized his real role as the servant of God, he became much more humble in his attitude towards those he considered inferior. This figure depicts the moment in Peter's life when he had finally overcome nature and realized what Jesus meant when he washed the feet of the apostles and told them they should be the servants of God's children. So the statue he had built, the carving he had done, was like Peter laying aside a crown and help like holding
A cripple or a blind.
yeah,
Yeah.
somebody in need essentially, and like kind of humbling himself,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And he gave this statue to a man who was a preacher who was very proud
Yeah.
and very haughty,
Yep.
yeah, and really liked his position,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he gave another statue of Peter to a more humble minister,
Mm-hmm.
right? That was Peter being more authoritative,
Yeah.
right? And when he had he gave them the statues at the same time,
Yep.
and when they saw them, they swapped statues,
Right.
Because they were like, I think that guy, that Peter, means more to me than that Peter,
Right.
But what happened?
Or they related to
Yes.
the other. Yeah.
Exactly,
And that was easy. I think that was key too. That it was easier for them to relate to that one.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But then Joshua's like, no, but I wanted you to grow,
Right.
right? And so they end up calling each other later and swapping statues,
Yeah.
realizing their mistake and kind of getting back to this. So, so I think that plays a part in this whole idea. Like, I think the minister that wanted the more humble Peter originally, but then ended up with the more authoritative Peter. I think this makes a lot of sense knowing that the author was Catholic. He describes that pastor's congregation as being very sola scriptura, which all authority comes in Scripture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're kind of dismissive of the apostolic tradition, right? Which is what Catholics put a lot more emphasis on, is apostolic tradition and church leadership tradition. And what I think this author does really, really well here is that there needs to be a level of reverence for both, right? Because the apostolic tradition, if you really think about it, I know some people might argue with me on this. That's not my intent. If you really think about it, the apostolic tradition is about living out the Scripture, right? So the tradition is created through living out the Scripture,
Correct.
in a lot of ways, right? So there is a balance there of understanding how, like, the Scripture is the authority, but those who live in the Scripture carry that authority.
Don't just be hearers of the word.
Be doers, exactly, right? So another point in this book, Joshua walks through like an office building of one of the churches, and I think it's like the Catholic
rectory,
yeah. And he says how much they enjoy the business of the kingdom. He thought, if only they could become fired up with the same zeal for souls, right? So he's kind of keen on this idea of, like, man, these church leaders they want to do what's easy. They want to, like, kind of be in their niche, but then, like, those who really get high up in some of these church leadership roles really seem to care more about doing the business of church, right? And they get so excited about the purchase of properties, the exercising of power,
governing the funds. Yeah,
exactly. They kind of miss the point of why they're doing all of those things.
I found it interesting. Joshua stresses that point more the higher up in specifically the Catholic Church that he goes to, where by the time he's talking to the cardinals and even the Pope at the Vatican.
Yeah.
That's almost the sole theme of his critique and conversation.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was interesting that he's pressing that more the higher he goes up, and how he feels that they're neglecting that shepherdship of God's people.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what we see is that there are some biblical parallels when we look at the life of Jesus here, right? And so he doesn't quote a lot of scripture, if any, in this book, which is kind of interesting, but you can see parallels, right? So, like Matthew 21:12 and 13, very famous verse. Jesus entered the temple area and drove out all those who were selling and buying on the temple grounds, And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he said to them, "It is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." Right? When we understand what was happening at the temple right there, the area where they did all this business, excuse me, is where the Gentiles were supposed to be worshiping because they couldn't go any further into the temple.
Right.
Right. They were essentially making the worship of God secondary to the business of the temple. And because they only cared about where they could go, they didn't care about bringing others along and basically delivering the Spirit of God to the whole world as opposed to just keeping it amongst themselves. Right. So I think that's a really good parallel to this concept that he deals with these religious leaders. Additionally, we see Matthew 23:25 through 28. Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may also become clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to people, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." Now, when I read that, I really feel like when we think about Jesus' interactions with the Pharisees, they're almost more combative, right? And the Pharisees really sound like awful people. What I think the book Joshua does a really good job at is that even the characters that he talks about who seem kind of, for lack of a better term, awful, all have a redeeming trait, right? Like we think about the haughty pastor who wants the authoritative Peter. He comes to his senses, right? He remembers why he started doing this to begin with, right? And he has this redeemable aspect of his life, right? When he's meeting with the Cardinals, right? The real issue that I guess what I felt like when he was kind of being put on trial, essentially, it was basically a trial, was that the people that were asking him the questions weren't really interested in his answers. They were almost indifferent, right?
Yeah.
They weren't out there trying to be deceitful. They had just lost the plot, right? And so much so that the one guy who there's one guy who was getting a little uneasy about their questioning, like has a stroke in the middle of the thing, and Joshua heals him.
Yep.
And then they just go on like nothing happened, right? And so I think sometimes we look for villainy to be really apparent. And we look for it to only come from people who are obviously villains, if that makes sense. And I think what the book Joshua does a really good job at is showing us that sometimes the best intending people, sometimes the people that really think they know what they're doing, in their attempt to protect or to do the right thing, end up being hurtful, end up causing harm, right? So I think he humanizes the Pharisees, so to speak, in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of people today, I think we all assume we would be followers of Jesus. I think we all assume that we would understand his teaching. I think we all assume that we wouldn't side with the Pharisees. This was something that I told you when I was reading this book, because there are some things about this book that are really ambiguous about how Joshua talks, that so often I found myself, like, from a theological standpoint, kind of agreeing with the characters that you're not supposed to be agreeing with. And I was like, oh, is that a problem? Do I need to, what do I need to think about here? So it was a really good kind of self-examination in that sense. But I don't know, it's just, I think this is one of those themes that, like, we have to go back to. We can see it clearly in what Jesus' ministry was, is if we're going to run a church, are we running it to be in power, or are we running it to save souls? You know, and so that's the first theme that I pulled from this.
Yeah.